Season 2, Episode 9 with Carole Westerkamp, Language Learning and NLP.
This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, helping you become a better language learner by providing motivating weekly inspiration, as well as top tips and tricks from expert guests. And now, your host, Chris Broholm.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. This is episode 9 of the second season, and I'm so excited, mostly because the sun is shining outside, my cold is clearing up, although you might still hear a little bit of it in today's episode, but I'm just feeling great. And today I just wanted to thank you for being a listener of the podcast. Thank you for downloading the episode every week, and thank you for the guys who send me emails. Thank you especially to the people who took the time to leave a review on iTunes. It only takes a minute or two, and it really helps the show. So if you have been using iTunes to listen to the show, or you're using iTunes now, go in and leave a review of the show, because it really helps. That's kind of like when iTunes looks at podcast quality, they say, who has a lot of reviews and ratings? And basically that gets the show out to more listeners, and, spreading the language learning love is all we're here for. So if you do that, thank you so much. It means a ton to me. One announcement I have today is that I'm happy to and really excited to announce the first real sponsor of the Actual Fluency Podcast. I have been sort of unofficially looking for sponsors for ever since maybe half a year ago or something. But the problem was, if I did get offers, it would be of very shady companies or, very questionable methods, high quality but low quality but high price products I didn't really believe in, or products completely unrelated to language learning. I was like, why would I advertise your, tires for cars? I didn't actually get a request to advertise tires, but you get the idea. People are like, oh, you have an audience, let me advertise my crap with you, basically. And I just said no, because I want the sponsors of the program to be as relevant as the content, and I want it to be good. I want to be able to trust the people behind it. I want to know that this is legit. It's not about the money. That doesn't really matter at the end. Of course, it helps me to produce better episodes. It helps me to produce more episodes to get a sponsor, but it's not the end-all, be-all. But I'm happy to announce that the Mellow Method, founded by Jimmy Mello, is going to be our sponsor for the next period of time, and you will hear a spot during today's episode where you can hear a little bit more about the Mellow Method. But basically the cool part about Mellow Method is that it's relevant to teachers and students of languages. So if you're interested in, starting your own little teaching business, you can actually become a Mellow Method teacher. And you can find all the information about that on mellowmethod.com. But I hope you'll enjoy it, and I hope you check out Mellow Method. I'm definitely going to be starting it, because part of the sponsorship deal, and I want to be totally honest with you guys. Part of the sponsorship deals is Jimmy's going to teach me Portuguese with the Mellow Method. And, as a language learner, you can't really turn that kind of deal down. So I took him up on that immediately, and we're going to be starting soon. And also that will give me a nice perspective on the Mellow Method. I can really tell you guys what I think about it, and I'll, of course, document my progress on the blog, and we'll see how that goes. But anyway, today's episode, we're jumping right into it now. And Carole Westerkamp, she's an amazing polyglot, amazing person, very kind. And she focuses in her talks about how language sort of shapes not only our surroundings, but also ourselves, sort of through NLP, which is Neurolinguistic Programming. And we get to talk a little bit about that today, and also her sort of learning languages by osmosis, it seems like. But maybe there isn't that much to it, but it's an interesting episode today, and I'm really excited to bring it to you. So have a great day wherever you are in the world, and may the sun shine on you, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, we're back with another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast, and today I'm very happy to welcome onto the show Carole Westerkamp. Carole, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. You sound like you have a bit of a cold, though.
Yeah, that's the tax for going to Berlin, I guess, the gathering. But I'm feeling much better now, and you're feeling good?
I'm feeling fine, thanks. Bit nostalgic though, missing the atmosphere in Berlin
Yeah,
of polyglots together.
yeah, it's always fun to go to meet a lot of polyglots. It's always so inspiring and motivational, and I'm sure we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But before we get into that, can we just get a little who's Carole? You know, what's your story? How did you get into learning languages? Because I know you speak a ton of languages. I actually don't know how many at this point, but how did you get into learning all these languages, and sort of what's the story behind it?
Haha, well, first of all, I'm Dutch, but you might say I'm like half Dutch because my mom was Canadian. So I was brought up bilingually. That helps. Um, Brought up in the Netherlands, but speaking English at home. And then in the Netherlands, at school, we learn German and French as well. It depends a little bit on your level of schooling, but well, most people do learn at least some of German and French. And at school, I wasn't really very good at languages, but then we went on holiday to what was then Yugoslavia. And I started learning Croatian, which I then called Serbo-Croatian, because, well, nobody seemed to speak any language I spoke, and I'm very communicative. So actually then I discovered like, hey, I'm very good at picking up these languages and these accents, because people very soon used to say, oh, are you from Slovenia? Because apparently people there have the same accent I do when they speak Croatian. And I said, no, I'm Dutch. Wow, you're really good. And then I started thinking, which is of course very important, that you have the belief that you can do it. I thought, oh, I am good at languages. I speak 5 languages. And well, actually it went from there on.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really cool, because then, let me see, when I finished high school, I studied physical education. Everybody said, why aren't you into languages? I said, well, because I can do that myself. I don't need to study them. And I thought it would be boring to translate other people's words. I was very talkative. I am very talkative myself. So I studied physical education, but I worked in Italy, teaching swimming and doing all kinds of, well, animation programs for the tourists. And I learned Italian in like, well, 2 weeks is a bit exaggerated, but with my French, and I had also had Latin and Greek at school, the ancient Latin and Greek. Well, with that, it seemed to me that I was speaking Italian within 2 weeks of being there.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know. And then I loved salsa dancing. So I went to places where there were lots of Latin Americans dancing salsa, and I started speaking Spanish. And actually, that's the way my language learning goes. I just throw myself into the crowd, kind of.
Wow.
Well, not like crowd surfing, but in a different way, maybe.
Yeah, that would be fun though.
Yeah. And it's, I don't know, I just seem to pick up the logic of the language, so people often say, oh, well, how about the grammar? And I say, yeah, well, if I hear people saying, for instance, in Spanish or Italian, the I is always with an O in the end, then I just pick that up. I don't need to consciously study that. So it's hablar, it's yo hablo,
Right.
and I don't know, comer, yo como. And I, that's something people don't understand, and maybe I don't even understand it myself, but I just, well, pick it up.
It's really interesting because when we were talking in Berlin recently, it seemed like you just kind of picked up languages. It didn't seem like much of a sort of a study effort. Like a lot of people have to, sit at the desk and go through some teaching courses and maybe, have some tutoring, and then maybe half a year later they're at a sort of a mediocre base level. But that you seem genuinely talented at picking up languages. Would that be a good assessment?
Well, I find it hard to say that about myself, but I think it is the case, because when I first went to the first Polyglot conference in, where was it, Budapest, I actually said that. I said, I'm a lazy polyglot, because I heard of all these people, wanting to take up their languages to the next level and studying like 20 minutes a day or 40 or whatever time slot. And I thought, I don't study. I don't really study. And my latest language, well, that I've been consciously studying for the first time was Greek, or is Greek. So I go to Greek class every week during an hour. But then again, I hardly ever do homework. And I see my fellow students struggling with grammar and they're not understanding things. And I don't know if the teacher explains like one time, I think, oh, yeah, that makes sense if I hadn't understood it already. And then, well, there it is.
Yeah, there it is.
So, and I also sometimes wonder because maybe that I'm also an NLP trainer, the Neurolinguistic Programming, and they state that there's like three types of people. You have the very visual people who need to see, for instance, languages in writing. You have the very auditive people who hear and kind of pick it up, and you have the kinesthetic people who feel. And I always thought, how is it possible that I'm so good at languages, yet I can't remember any song texts? I used to sing in a choir, and we had to learn all the lyrics off by heart because they didn't want us to sing with books.
Right.
And I just kept singing, either the wrong things or I didn't really remember what to sing. So I would just mouth kind of play back thinking, gosh, that's strange because if I once learn a language, I never forget it.
Right.
So I must be auditive. And actually, I have come to think that I'm more of a kinesthetic person. I feel what people mean. And that's how I incorporate the language within me, I think.
Right.
But I'm not 100% sure.
Well, also it's an imperfect science anyway, isn't it? I mean, you can't say that this is how it works because it's some boxes that we drew up sort of arbitrarily to sort of match behavior. And when you go that way, it's always like you squeeze people into the boxes instead of making the boxes bigger or different shapes or whatever,
Yeah, right.
So I don't think it's for me it's very interesting either way, because I think that something you said earlier is also very important. Like you said that you told yourself that you were good at languages. Mm-hmm. Because
Yes.
that must have boosted it immensely at the beginning, where most people's experience with languages start with, okay, we get a free native language, maybe two, and they don't worry about learning anything. And then they get to school and they have those boring grammar lessons and they don't really get anywhere. And then they're like, oh, I'm rubbish at languages. And then you start sort of telling yourself that you're terrible at languages. And then, I mean, that's when it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. But maybe even more important there is just the interest. Because I think even before I told myself I was good at it, I was so interested in communicating. So I actually have always seen a language as, well, the means to communicate with people. And I myself am a teacher now of English and German. And this is actually what I miss in my students and can't seem to, well, anyway, not in all cases, I'm able to kindle, to awaken that spirit in them, this curiosity, like, oh, so how do I say that in different language?
Right.
Also, of course, I am dependent of course books, which, as you say, can be very boring and unmotivating. But whatever other things I think of, well, it doesn't always seem to resonate with my students.
They treat it a little bit
They,
like math, maybe, where you have to remember some
yes,
facts and
yes,
right.
you're exactly right. Although the funny thing was, people also say sometimes that, well, if you're good at maths, you're not good at languages. And actually, a colleague of mine who is a physics teacher, he said, well, I discovered that languages are very logical.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a sense, it's like learning, well, math, like anything. You have a number like x to the my 2 plus 4 is 8. So what is x, And actually, that is the way how languages do work. Like if you have a verb, let me take the Spanish hablar again, then, okay, if you put yo in front of it, then what does it change to? So there is this logic.
Right. And of
And I don't know, maybe that's what I understand quickly in a language. Maybe that helps in language learning,
right. And of course, there's also the element of assimilation, which actually it took me a really long time to realize that Assimil, the French company name, actually was based on the word assimilation. It took me like 100 years. I was like, Assimil, that's such a nice name. And then one day I was like, this is really an assimilate. Oh, wait. You know,
Oh.
so that's pretty funny. But it does sound like that's what you're doing, and I know a lot of people are quite good at. They sort of when they get a lot of comprehensible input, they sort of decode what's important. And I know that that's something you also talked about in your talk at Budapest.
Hmm.
You talked about how if our minds had to really consider everything we saw and consider all of the input, then we would be, doing nothing but just being overpowered all the time.
Yes.
So a lot gets pushed into the, I guess it's just a subconscious, or maybe not even registered. It maybe just goes out again. But that's also got something to do with it. That from experience as well. That this word I won't really need. I don't know the word for. I don't know, moving piston in an engineering piece or something. I mean, you just realize, okay, the chances I'm going to use this in Italian or whatever is quite limited. So I'd probably better you learn the word for a drink or a beer or something, that you would actually use. Uh,
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's indeed something I do try to do in school with my students. Well, actually, I don't try, I do it.
all right.
um, I tell them, okay, what words would you want to know if you go to a place where they speak German or English, what would you want to communicate with people? That's why course books usually start with things about yourself and your own world because, yeah, hey, that's what we talk about when we speak to others. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Don't speak about 20 different kinds of birds.
No, because the funny thing is I did an Arab course, and one of the first words, and the funny thing is, of course, that's the word that sticks most to my mind, is the word for, and I don't think I even know it in English. It's called quitten in German. Kweepeer. What is it in English? It's a kind of
It's a
a pear.
sparrow or something.
No, it's a pear that you can't eat, but
Oh,
you can put it, you can make it to jelly. But in Arabic, it's called safarjala. Now, if I don't even know the word in English,
right.
and I mean, funnily enough, in Berlin, staying at my uncle's place, he made a jelly or jam, actually, a kind of a marmalade from these quitten. That's why I know the word in German now. But I mean, I thought, why would I want to know that word, in a language if I don't, well, I had never eaten it up
Right.
to then, and that's what course books often do.
Yeah, that's the shame, I think, that they
Yeah.
focus on these things because one of the big aha moments for me was when I was looking at the kind of hacking foreign language conversation. I was looking at the work Anthony Lauder did, for instance,
Hmm.
where he said, well, you might not know all the nouns, but or the so-called important things, but
Hmm.
you can just learn. First of all, you can just learn the word thing if you're doing English. So you
Hmm.
can say like the thing that flies, for instance,
Hmm.
or you can have those sentence connectors, where you can say, that's a good question, because that gives you some time to think about
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
what's the real word that I'm looking for here.
That's true.
So for me, that was quite cool. That well, you don't really need to know much. It's just like that thing, that person, that place. I mean, that
Yes.
covers pretty much every noun in the world, and most of the time people are going to understand from context, or you can add another word to it. So like that becomes a little bit Tokipona-ish, but anyway, you can say like holy man, that's obviously a minister or the Pope or something. Or
Exactly. Well, I always teach my students as well to learn opposites. Like I say, okay, you learn fat and thin, and then if you don't remember the word for thin, then you say not fat.
exactly, that's 50% vocabulary right there.
Yeah.
That's genius. And Esperanto, of course, is famous for having these features built in, where
Hmm.
you can just put a prefix on a word, and then it instantly turns it into the opposite.
Yes.
For instance, I was at an Esperanto course in Berlin, and I couldn't remember the word for man,
Hmm.
so I just said mal virino, I think. So not woman,
Yeah.
and they understood me. Of course, they corrected me because it's not good Esperanto
No,
form.
no.
But the point is being understood, isn't it? It's not about being correct. That's also one of the pillars. Is you should just speak and be understood, and then as you get feedback, as you hear more input, the language automatically corrects itself, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The funny thing is, I think most people are very scared of making mistakes. And, well, this was also a topic in Novi Sad, of course. and Claudio also points it out, that if you speak of mistakes, then that automatically implies that it's wrong. So, yeah, mistakes on itself is a word that, well, it doesn't come in handy for language learning, because I think you should just speak, and whenever it is not completely correct, people will tell you what the correct form is. But if you see it as a mistake, then it's like, oh my God, I made a mistake.
Right.
Whilst it's just that your speech is not yet perfect. I mean, like small kids learn a language. If a kid says, I wanting milk, then the mother will just, or the father or anybody around will just repeat, oh, you want milk. They won't say, what? You said wanting. That's wrong.
Right.
So that also helps. Just speak. And the funny thing is, I haven't ever learned Esperanto yet. But Sylvain, the French guy who's lived in Holland for a long time,
Yeah.
who teaches Esperanto, he spoke to me like an hour in Esperanto, and I spoke back to him in Spanish, and we had a perfect conversation.
Yeah.
It was really cool. And the same actually happened when I spoke to Yakov. He spoke Yiddish to me, and I spoke German back. And then, after like 5 minutes, we completely forgot that the other person didn't really speak our language
Right.
or only had a certain level. And, well, sometimes if we didn't quite understand, we were like, sorry. And then, well, you use other words and you understand each other.
Exactly. And before we move on to the next question, Carol, I just wanted to take a moment to listen to a message from our sponsor.
Mellow Method is the learning revolution since 1995. Now, you can make your dream of living your passion for languages real. Do you want a method that really teaches you a language? What if you could have your own school and get success teaching your students perfect lessons, 100% focused on conversation? Even if you have no experience, Mellow Method will work where other methods can't. With Mellow Method, you will overcome the speaking barrier from Lesson 1. Jimmy Mello, the Brazilian polyglot, has created the best method to teach any foreign language. It's now available in 11 languages from English to Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese, including Mandarin and Polish. Be a polyglot with Mellow Method. Access right now www.mellowmethod.com and reach your goals with Mellow Method, the best method ever created to teach and learn any language.
What does it take to be able to make mistakes? Because when I started out in language learning, I was exactly the same. I was like, I needed to be sure that the sentence was correct before I send it off. Like if I was doing IM or stuff. And of course I could never really know, but my sort of proofing was, okay, am I relatively sure of the sentence? And I'm like, okay. So if I pasted it into Google Translate and it didn't give any, suggestions below, that was kind of my error filter. And of course it's not perfect, but it just shows you the fear of mistakes to a degree where I should have just been typing and not really bothered too much about it. I mean, of course there's some element of learning in it as well, but it also really inhibited my speaking because I would be thinking so hard about the next sentence. I don't want to make a mistake, so I need to prepare the sentence.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that. I had that problem with Arabic. I had a teacher from Iran, and she was actually the only one I spoke or I could speak Arabic to, and I've always felt very inhibited. So I think it depends also on the receiving party. If you find a teacher or anybody who you are speaking to or, well, typing with, let's say, I think they should give you the confidence, or they should, how should I put that? Install in you the confidence that it doesn't matter whatever you say, whatever you write, they'll just kind of shrug it off and correct you in a soft way, because I'm not sure who said it. I've been attending so many lectures at all these conferences. Maybe it was Anthony Lauder, maybe it was someone else who said, well, if there's somebody who really behaves like well, this is not a very nice word, the grammar Nazi, as they sometimes call them,
Right.
or they immediately say, no, you shouldn't say that, you should say this. Well, then you're kind of put off and you think, oops. Then you'll think twice the next time before you say anything or write anything. But if it's somebody who just matter-of-factly corrects you, then it's like, oh, okay. It's okay to make non-correct sentences.
Yeah, and I find that in a sort of a real environment, like if you're in the gathering and you're practicing languages, people are very unlikely to correct you. I mean, if they're native speakers, of course, they have a higher propensity to do so. But if they're not native speakers but have a really high level in the language, they know the struggles that you're going through. So they'll sort of just say, as long as they understand you, they'll let you keep speaking, which I think is the most important thing. And definitely what changed for me was that I suddenly just threw caution to the wind and I was just speaking, and my tutor had to be like, what does that mean? Because I was starting to make up words in Russian, which
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah.
sometimes you can do that, in particularly in Russian, because it's so logical that, you know, you can change words from nouns to adjectives to verbs by some very common endings. But of course there are exceptions, and they don't all have that ending. It's not Esperanto after all. But and she was like, what does that mean? And actually sometimes I would get frustrated that she couldn't see the connection,
Yeah.
you know.
Like, I can see it. How come you don't see it? Yeah.
Yeah, or like if you use the different verb, you know, in Russian there are like 10 different words to for the English to go, depending if you're going one way or back, or if you're going by foot, or if you're going by vehicle, blah blah blah. There's tons of them, and sometimes she would just not understand at all, even just because I used the wrong go. And I was like, why don't you understand? Because it's in English. I know that go can mean any form. And then I took it a step further, and I was like, well, even if you don't understand the exact meaning, can't you sort of can't you just go
Yeah.
inside my head and see what I'm trying to say? You know?
Exactly. Well, I found it even an example. I don't even know how to call it, but I was in the Dominican Republic, and I thought I already spoke Spanish very well, and I asked for an ice cream, and I said vainilla, and she said, what? And I kind of even pointed out to the vanilla ice cream, and I said vainilla, and she said, oh, vainilla. And I thought, my God, can't you understand me? I mean, between the distance between like vainilla and vainilla,
Right.
or vainilla, as they would say in Argentina, is not very big. I mean, how come she didn't understand me? Then I thought, well, okay, so maybe people who are not used to people who have another mother tongue, speaking their language, it would sound strange.
Yeah, I'm
So,
sure. And it's just you're attacking the problem with a curious language learner mind, so
yeah,
you can see connections, because I think that's the biggest power trait of a polyglot is they see connection. For instance, if you see a word that in a language and it reminds you of a word in another language, you see it immediately.
exactly.
You see it immediately. So you're connecting basically all your languages. And so when people don't understand even a connection in their own language, when it seems blatantly obvious,
Yeah.
it's kind of a funny situation. But
It's surprising, yeah. You think, well, how's that possible? And you start indeed finding connections in so many ways. Like, for instance, in Indonesia, I was a tour leader for a long time, and of course, there's a lot of Dutch because it has been a Dutch colony. Of course, there's like Portuguese heritage. I mean, the Portuguese sailed over there as well. So, for instance, igreja in Portuguese is gereja in Indonesian, things like that. But then when I started learning Greek, all of a sudden I realized that the word for head, kifali, in Indonesian is kepala. And I thought, well, that's strange. You start finding these,
yeah,
that they're like little treasures. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's so cool. I found a Greek word in Indonesian.
there you go. I mean,
Yeah.
there are German words in Russian as well, which is, I mean, perhaps not surprising, but it's just weird. You don't expect it when you're listening to Russian speakers and they suddenly say something like "Butterbrot," you know.
Ah, no, you don't. That's
That's
funny. Yeah.
it's so funny, but anyway, wanted to talk to you a little bit about the aspect of moving to the country, because it seems like you've done that quite a lot. Do you think that's a hugely winning strategy for most people, or do you think it takes a certain kind of person to sort of take in a lot? Because you hear about a lot of people who, for instance, Benny's famous story was like, I spent a year in Spain, I expected to learn Spanish, I didn't learn anything. Um, you know, how is that relationship?
Well, I'm not completely sure. I mean, I think it's different for everybody, but I've never actually lived in the countries. I mean, I was there, like when I went to Italy to work in a hotel. Yes, I spent some time there, but that was like 2 months. So I don't really think I moved there. In Indonesia, I was a tour leader, but I went there like 3 weeks, moving around constantly with Dutch people. So it wasn't that I was speaking Indonesian all day long. And then I went back to Holland again for a week or 2 weeks and then back to
Right.
Indonesia. So,
So is that a better strategy? I mean, if you're just going for those, I guess you can call it like intensive periods in the country, because you kind of know, okay, I only got 2 months, so I better not, slack off too much. But if you live there and you say, okay, I'm going to stay here until I learn it, then that just, I guess the challenge just grows to the time that you have. So maybe is that a factor?
yeah, probably. The thing is, that's why I keep being a bit surprised, like, oh, I am actually a polyglot because, well, the talk Richard did in Berlin now, he said you have these accidental multilingual people. And then I thought, oh, maybe that's a better description of me. I don't know. I seem to keep learning all these languages by accident because whenever I really say, okay, now I'm going to learn a language, then I'm not as well, I don't progress as quickly and I'm not as good at it. I mean, I bought a book after having been in Budapest. I bought a book to learn Hungarian. But then once I was back in Holland, I thought, why am I actually wanting to learn Hungarian?
Right.
And because it also depends on why you pick the language you want to learn. You know,
Mm.
actually, I've always learned the language, for instance, Indonesian, because I knew I was going to go there for a longer period of time. Like, okay, so next month I'll be going there again, and 3 weeks later again. So it made sense. Although people did say, well, why would you want to learn the language? You have a local guide who speaks Dutch or English. So why would you want to learn the language? And then I thought, yeah, but I want to communicate when I'm there.
Hmm.
So basically, for me, it's not like, aha, I want another language on my card the next time I go to the conference. For me, it's like I'm going to learn a language to be able to speak to people who I will be visiting, more than once.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then by the time I know the language, probably I'll never visit them again for for whatever reason.
But then it's there,
Um,
you can reactivate it if you
Yes, well,
need.
that's it. And then once I know it, I know it. But the thing is, like what Benny says, yeah, that you have to go there. No, I don't believe that
Oh, no, I don't
because,
think he said that. I don't think he said that. His story was just that he wasn't in Spain for a year and didn't learn any
oh,
Spanish. So that was just a
okay,
horror story of immersion failing.
okay. Well, I think, yeah, like everything, it's so relative. It depends on the person. But I don't think for me it would be possible to go and live in a country and not learn the language because I'm communicative and I communicate with everybody. I mean, the street sweepers, the garbage men, the selling, sales personnel in the shops. Yeah, so then you have to communicate.
Yeah, and that's also why I guess because you're. I mean, would it be safe to say that you're an extroverted person in that case?
Yes, for me. Very safe.
Good, good. Because then I could see that some introverts might have trouble just sort of speaking in a completely foreign language, in a completely foreign environment. So
Hmm.
perhaps it's the challenge of I don't know, getting out of your comfort zone, and I don't know, it's also hard, if you're really shy and introverted, and it's kind of harsh to just say, well, go out and speak to someone, you'll get there.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. A lot of people kind of seem to have well, they portray themselves as being the ones who have all the knowledge. I don't think that that is me, and I would never go out and say to anybody like, "Oh, you should do this or you should do that."
Right.
I tell people, find your own way, and for some people, it may very well be the best way ever to sit at home and study grammar and, you know, read books or whatever and learn. Although I do think that the best way to learn the language is to to anyway express yourself in it. So whether you speak to other people or just recite poems. I saw Judith reciting, or I saw and I heard her reciting a Chinese poem. So reading out loud.
Right.
I think Professor Argelis talked about that in Novi Sad. Reading out loud or writing letters. That's actually how I learned Croatian, more than even being in Croatia on holiday. After I was at home, I started writing letters, and my first letters must have been, like a 6-year-old who's just learned how to write. But yeah, the people I wrote to kept writing back, and then I thought, oh, so that's actually the way you should say it. Oh, okay, and yeah, that's how I learned.
Fantastic. And also, I've noticed that you took part in most of the gatherings and conferences that's been held so far. What made you go to the one in Budapest? Was kind of the foundation for all these?
Yeah, well, I don't actually know how, because I don't think I was consciously searching for polyglots, because as I said, I didn't even know I was one. But I came across some of these videos by Alex and by Richard, and then and Luca also, and then I found out that they were, through Facebook, I think, that they were doing this polyglot thing in Budapest. And then since I saw that the program would be mainly on the subject we're talking about now, I volunteered and I said, well, hey, how would you like me to speak of the use of language, well, any language whatsoever, because that's also what interests me, in how do people put things, in their own language? How do they phrase things? Because every language is a different view onto the world. And, well, being an NLP trainer, that's also something that really interests me. Like, for instance, if I tell people, oh, language learning is really difficult, well, do you think that sounds motivational? No.
No.
So what NLP does is it says, and that's something you do yourself, when you said, well, sometimes you just use the opposite, for a female is not a man. Well, if you want to say difficult, you can say not easy, because the brain will hear the word easy.
Right.
And that's something that I wanted to bring across, that no matter what language you speak, and of course, I don't speak all the languages in the world, so I can't be sure about, for instance, Chinese or any language I don't speak, how they phrase things. Yet I think it's important to realize, that you can also help your language learning by influencing yourself in the way you phrase things.
Right. Like if you're struggling at home, you can't seem to get the motivation to pick up the phrase, the Assimil or whatever. Mm-hmm. Are there any tips and tricks we can do to ourselves to change our sort of programming, as it called?
Yes, what they use a lot in hypnosis actually is also like future pace. That okay, maybe at this point it's not working out exactly the way I want it to, and I'm sure that within a week I will have made progress.
Uh-huh.
So that is a way of programming yourself. That's why it's called neurolinguistic programming.
Right.
Programming yourself with the language you use, whatever language that may be, to be successful. So then you will say, so okay, maybe the step of me wanting to learn 20 words a day is a little much. I'm sure I can do at least 5. And then when you do the 5, then you're like, okay, this was a success. So if I can do 5, I can at least do 10 tomorrow. And that way you build it up.
Right.
So no, not like, oh my God, I'm so stupid, I can't remember these 20 words. That doesn't help. So you have to kind of find the language you can use talking to yourself that is helpful.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. But the one thing I understand the idea of positive thinking, because and also the positive phrasing of things. Mm-hmm. Because it really is true that if you think that there's something you can't do, then you can't do it, because that's the limitation of our minds. If we convince ourselves we can't do something, then the chances of us doing it is like 0, or maybe 0.1. But anyway, the only thing I'm thinking is like when you say, well, you should tell yourself this, or you should then try and say that. Does that mean we have to sit in a sort of chant, or before we go studying, or
No, no.
or is
No,
it? Do you have
no,
it on
and
a note?
should is
Or
also no, should is also a big word. As I said, I don't know. I don't like telling people what they should do
well,
because
you're a
that's
trainer. You have to at least assert some, right?
pressure. Yeah,
Yeah,
pressure.
you
Uh,
must.
yeah, you must. Well, those are what I call the red words. The green words, like you are allowed to, you may, you can. You know,
Right.
they sound more positive. But no, it's not like a chant. It is changing your beliefs, and you can only do that by self-speech. I mean, people can tell you as well. So the self-speech is your thinking, and you don't need to chant it to yourself. What you can do is say, okay, how realistic are my goals? Let's start with small steps, you know, like 5 words instead of 20, and take it from there.
Right. I
Then,
mean, keep it achievable.
yes, exactly.
It's really interesting. It's I love when the podcast when the talk here makes me like, that's interesting because I totally believe in the power of like words. I think if you tell yourself you're no good, then you will just seek to fulfill that sort of prophecy, you know?
Yeah, well, exactly. And there was a talk at the in Berlin as well about I think it was Ulysses who told about, you know, in certain languages there are only a limited amount of words for things, for instance. And then I said, yes, well, like in Spanish, you don't have feet. I mean, of course you have feet, and in Greek as well. But you say, or you have feet. No, sorry, you do have feet, but you don't have toes.
Right.
So, for instance, you would say dedo de la mano, which is the finger of the hand, and you would say dedo del pie.
Right.
So
Finger
for
of
me,
the
it sounds
foot.
like the finger of the foot, and that's what is interesting. That language does influence the way we think.
For sure.
So knowing that, it also influences the way we feel, because how we feel is a direct. Now I can't think of the word. Speaking of all these words, the consequence of the way we think, because yeah, like if I walk in the street and I see you somewhere and I say, hey Chris, and you don't answer, well, either I think, oh gosh, he doesn't want to see me, I think he doesn't like me anymore, what's wrong with him, you know, what's wrong with me, whoa, and then I start feeling depressed. Yeah. Or if I wave and you don't respond, I think, ah, he's probably with his thoughts, you know, somewhere else. He didn't hear me. And then I won't feel bad. I'll feel perfectly normal. So the way we think has an influence on the way we feel, and therefore it influences our learning.
Yeah, it's it's incredible, and I actually I recommend people watch the full presentation you did because there were a lot of like aha moments or like that really made people think, and it was a very well received presentation. I know we're running a little bit short on time here, but apart from being positive, try not to use the negative words. Are there any other tips as an NLP trainer you could pass on to people to improve their language training and maybe their lives in general?
Yeah, and the time we're still okay. And the presentation you were talking about, I think the one that was more NLP was the one in Budapest,
Right, exactly, yeah.
because the one in Novi Sad was a bit more about, well, metaphors and yeah,
Storytelling.
storytelling. Well, one other tip is that people who are very visual, for instance, the visual memory is in the left top of our how should I say that? When you put your eyes, you turn your eyes up to the left corner and upwards. So left in each person.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
That's where the visual memory is. So if you watch people's interviews on television, for instance, and they will recall something they have seen, you will always see their eyes moving to the top
Ah.
left. This is not like I'm a lie detector or so, but that's where their visual memory is. So if they want to call up an image, you will usually see their eyes going up left. For the ones watching, of course, that is to the right. I hope I'm making myself clear here.
Yep.
Anyway, so if you really have problems internalizing a certain word or the spelling of a word, then you can hang it up in your room or your study somewhere where you have to look up to the left. Yeah, that's what I tell people with dyslexia as well. That really helps.
Right. Yeah, that's a funny
So,
thing, isn't it? This
yeah,
dyslexia. I mean, we could talk for about that for a whole episode as well, I think.
yeah,
But
yeah, as well.
I was always fascinated about that because I mean, when you don't have it, you just don't understand it. You know,
No,
you
exactly.
can attempt to sort of, I guess, what's the word I'm thinking of? Empathize. It's so hard to do the th if you're Danish, but you know what I mean.
Empathize, yeah.
Empathize,
Empathize. Well,
emphasize. Yeah.
the thing is, we had a training as teachers. There was this man, I think he's about 60, and he gave a training because he discovered that he had dyslexia only when he was like 45 or 50 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so he always thought he was stupid. I don't know how he could have thought that because he did pass, he has a university degree, but he said, yeah, I was always so slow in reading. Well, of course, now we know why. So he had all kinds of texts in little scribbles and letters, and he was then saying, well, this is what it looks like to me. And I was like, wow, that's pretty unintelligible.
Right. And they're changing the world. They're changing that now. Actually, I just read an article recently about there's some, I call them scientists, whatever. They designed a computer font that highlights features of each letter so they don't look so similar, which is really cool. I mean, when you think about it, that's like inventing the glasses or the wheel or something. You know, it's
Yeah, it's
really incredible. But it just makes a lot of sense that if you could, the letters are quite similar when you think about it. I mean, I don't want to go into like Russian cursive because that's just the same all the time. But when you have the English alphabet, a lot of the letters have the same kind of shape, and
yeah, that's true.
it's just so what they did was they took the letters where dyslexics get confused because, as you know, when you're reading, you're not really reading every letter. You just kind of, the brain just sees something and then it fills in the blank. And only if you don't know the word do you get stumped by it. But for dyslexic people, if they get stumped every other word, that's really when the trouble starts. And
Yes.
they need to distinguish more between those similar letters. So that's just a cool development. I think that they made some of the letters a little bit angled, and they added a little bit of an extra tail to one of the letters, and I just thought it was really cool. But again, it's taken a long time.
I can imagine.
Exactly. So I think I'll let you go for now because you said you had an appointment. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time and also enduring all the technical problems that we had leading up to this.
Yeah, well, it was you that was doing the enduring. I was just getting a bit frustrated
Yeah, it's no
because I
problem.
wanted to be in time, so that's okay. Are you
Thank you so
still there?
much. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. Sorry, I just had to cough because I'm still a little sick, but not as sick as last week. But feeling good. But when you make me laugh, I have to cough afterwards. So, but yeah, it was a great pleasure, and it was a great pleasure to meet you in person in Berlin as well. And I'm sure we'll meet somewhere in Europe, not too far away from here.
No, well, you're always welcome in Holland.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast. If you would like to get more out of the podcast, check out the VIP Club by going to actualfluency.com/VIP.